Gonna be there with you today. I had a doctor's appointment, and my dog's barking in the background. So anyway, just ignore her. I just wanted to do a real quick introduction for you guys on some early River Valley civilization stuff. We're talking about Mesopotamia. I'm gonna try to make this brief so I can give you guys some time to work on the homework that I'm gonna have Mr. Rains give you guys in class. So let me just kind of give this um, some basic information about Mesopotamia. If you guys want to hold off on taking notes on this, you guys can wait until next time we meet on Wednesday of next week, and I can give you all this information then as well, and I can share it with you. So anyway, I wanted to kind of start us off by taking a look at these Mesopotamia specifically and the beginnings of civilization. So we've already talked about this a little bit, so you guys should already be aware of this, but some of the very earliest known civilizations will actually spring up in a place known as the Fertile Crescent, in an area known as Mesopotamia. And we know that Mesopotamia, as we've talked about before, means the place between two rivers. So Mesopotamia is right in the middle of the Tigris and the Euphrates River. And if you look at this map I have for you here, there's a couple of notable places. You guys might be familiar with at least you should be familiar with because we talked about last time. You also should be familiar with Baghdad. That's the capital of Iraq. So the current capital of Iraq. And if you look over on the other side, you've got a place called Lebanon, and in Lebanon you've got Beirut, and just to the east of there you have Damascus in Syria. So those are modern places, but this is a map of Mesopotamia. And of course, this area is also known as the Fertile Crescent. Again, we talked about that as well, and it's known as the Fertile Crescent because it's very fertile land, very good for growing crops. So anyway, civilization began in this part of the world. Now, the Sumerians that lived there faced very distinct challenges of their own. And we're going to kind of talk about each of these civilizations and what their challenges were. In the case of Mesopotamia and the Sumerians, we have very distinct challenges, especially in regards to flooding. The flooding along the Tigris and Euphrates River were very, very unpredictable, which meant that it was hard to tell from one year to the next how much water you were going to have. Some years you had way too much. Some years you had not enough. And so consequently, the Mesopotamians had to figure out a way to deal with the unpredictable flooding. The other piece that they had to struggle with was there was no natural barriers in Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is pretty wide open, and so consequently, there's really really no built-in protection to the cities that cropped up in Mesopotamia. Now, the last thing the Sumerians really had to deal with was the fact that there was no, or at least limited, natural resources. In fact, one of the things we know about Mesopotamians is one of the things that they built with, because they had to, was mud. They didn't have a lot of other options, and so they began to make clay bricks. They used mud and clay to make clay bricks, to make, for the most part, nearly all of their buildings and wall structures around their cities. Now, they could trade, and we'll talk about that in just a minute, but that was kind of on the rare side. So how did they deal with these various problems? Well, first of all, we know that organization, when people settle down and begin living together, and we begin having organized government and religion, job specialization, and writing and arts and architecture and infrastructure, we also begin to be able to problem solve some of the big problems that face us. And so in the case of the Mesopotamians, first of all, when we have unpredictable flooding, Mesopotamians decided, hey, let's have irrigation. Okay, that's not going to be the case with places like Nile. Now, they had irrigation, but not like the Mesopotamians had. In the Nile, all they simply had to do was dig canals, and the canals brought water from the Nile wherever it needed to go. And the Nile was a very predictable flooding circumstance. So they knew year after year about how much water they would get. That wasn't the case in Mesopotamia. So the Mesopotamians very brilliantly came up with a way to have irrigation. If you look at this little picture here, this is an artist's rendering, certainly, of what the Mesopotamians had. But in essence, what they were able to figure out was that it didn't matter how much water you had in either the Tigris or the Euphrates River, as long as you had the ability to get that water to the farms that needed it. And so this is a very early pump system, and we actually still kind of do irrigation like this today, and I'll address that here in just a minute. But if you look, you've got this long chain of jugs, and they're all connected by a rope. And they roll on this wheel. And so what the Mesopotamians did is they rolled this around. And so every day it was the job of multiple people. And if you look at this particular instance, you can see they've got a couple of cows pushing this in a circle. And it was the job of multiple people to make sure that pump, in essence, was working every day. And so what it would do is it would draw those jugs down to the water, fill the jug with water, bring the jug back up, and dump the jug as it's coming around the top of that wheel into a trough. And then that trough would carry the water out to other parts of the city / farms outside the city. And so with that, they didn't necessarily have to worry so much about irrigation. Now, like I said, we talked about this, or I mentioned it, that we still do this today. In fact, here in Nebraska, we use some river water for our irrigation, but for the most part, most of our farmers around this area tend to draw their water out of the Ogallala Aquifer. The same idea. I mean, we have years where we have a lot of water in the river, we have years where there's very little water in the river. And so we can kind of depend on the Ogallala Aquifer as a much more constant and reliable source of water, but it's clear underground. It's a very deep underwater lake. In fact, it's the largest underwater lake in the world. And we have to get that water to the surface somehow. So we have pumps. We have electric pumps now, but we have pumps that draw that water to the surface that we use, and we use that to irrigate our crops. So that's how they overcame the unpredictable flooding part. Now, as far as the no natural defenses, the simple fix there is all of our cities just have to have walls. So we build walls around all of them. Like I said, we use mud bricks, clay bricks, and that's what Mesopotamians did. And then the other way that they overcame some of these difficulties was with a lack of natural resources, they simply traded with other countries or other city-states, which is a term we'll learn here in just a minute, to get those natural resources. For example, one of the things that they often needed was wood. And wood is not very plentiful, at least trees aren't very plentiful in Mesopotamia. So one of the places they traded to get that wood was Lebanon, which was well known for their cedar plants. Okay, so anyway, by about 3000 BC, Mesopotamia has actually a pretty surprisingly large number of cities. And these cities are surrounded by wheat and barley fields. And each of these individual cities became very, very powerful. In fact, these cities began to grow. And as they grew, their power increased. And as their power increased, they began exerting pressure and power on the areas surrounding them. And so when we have a situation like that, where one single city controls the entire area around it, we have what's called a city-state. Okay, and so a city-state is where one city controls the entire area around it. And there is actually modern city-states. A perfect example of that is the city of Vatican City, which is in the middle of Rome. And Vatican City is the home of the Pope. Okay, that's maybe how you know it better. But Vatican City is its own government. The Pope's actually the mayor of Vatican City, and Vatican City controls the area around it. Now, it doesn't control all of Rome, obviously, but it controls Vatican City and the immediate area around it. So Vatican City is considered a city-state today. That's a very important concept, and we're going to talk a little bit more about city-states later on. But city-states are also very important. So in the case of Mesopotamia, though, the governments of these city-states were controlled by priests. So most of Mesopotamia was a theocracy. And the way this worked was farmers, who are largely the main source of life in the city-states, because we have to have food, they depended on the gods, or what they perceived as the gods, to help them grow their crops. Because they depended so much on the gods to help them grow their crops, they looked to the priests to act as intercessors. So the priests were kind of the go-betweens between the gods and the farmers. And so to do that job, priests required a portion of crops. And so in essence, farmers would pay priests with their crops to be the go-betweens between the gods and the farmers, if that makes sense. Now, in addition to the theocracy, the idea that the priests were also in charge of the government, it very quickly became apparent to these civilizations that they also needed to defend themselves, not only from the aspect of building walls around their city, but it doesn't do you any good to have a wall if you also don't have a military. And so oftentimes these priests very quickly became military commanders, and they became very important. And then, of course, as these commanders gained power, they, in essence, became kings. So all of these little city-states had a priest who was also the military commander, who was also the king, or who also ruled the territory that he was in charge of. And so these commanders would gain power, and one of the things they wanted to do is they wanted to pass that power on to their children. And so to do that, they established what we call dynasties. And so a dynasty is simply a series of rulers from one family. Okay, and so they would establish these very powerful dynasties, wherein which, unless something happened, that power would be transferred directly from a king to his kids. And so, consequently, the chain of rule stayed within one single family. Now, eventually, as their power grew, and as these little countries, or little city-states, I should say, became more and more influential, they began to spread their culture. And this is what we call cultural diffusion, or culture begins to filter out. And so a lot of these early cultures that are taking place in Mesopotamia and Egypt and in India and in the Indus Valley, they have some very similar ideas. Their religions are very similar. They're typically all theocracies. And what's interesting about that is that kind of indicates that cultural diffusion was happening all over the world. That these cultures were intermingling, and that diffusion was kind of spreading out. Now, we're going to talk next time about how that culture might have spread throughout the Fertile Crescent. But so we'll worry about that in a little bit. But so Sumerian culture, let's kind of talk briefly about that. And Sumerians were polytheistic. We already talked about that. You know, that means that they had many gods. And the gods in Sumerian culture were human-like, but man served them. That's a little different from, say, the Egyptian civilization, where the gods were very animal-like. They were man-like, but they were also animal-like. Excuse me. And the men still served them in that civilization as well. But in Sumeria, they were very human-like. We also know that the Sumerians wrote myths and they wrote stories. We have evidence of that in tablets written in cuneiform. One of the most prolific ones, and if you ever go on to be an English major, you might wind up reading this, but one of the most prolific stories is the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh is what we call an epic poem, which means it's about a hero, an epic hero. And that epic hero has something happen to him. It's a big tragic story. And next time when we meet, we'll talk briefly about epics and epic poems and the Epic of Gilgamesh. And we'll also talk about another epic that'll be written in the Middle Ages called Beowulf, which is also a pretty classic epic. So anyway, the Epic of Gilgamesh, we'll come back to that when I'm back there again. We also had social classes in Mesopotamia: kings, priests, merchants, general laborers, slaves. And along with that, at the very bottom of the social class ladder, we had debt slavery and foreign slavery. And debt slavery was a little different than foreign slavery. Foreign slavery was if we took you over, you know, if you were the enemy and we captured your city-state, you just were our slaves. That's foreign slavery. Debt slavery, on the other hand, was if you owed somebody a lot of money, they could make you be a slave to them. We'll talk some more about that as well. Women in Mesopotamia also had a very unique status. And this is kind of unusual for ancient world women, but women in Mesopotamia could work. They could be merchants, they could be farmers, they could be artisans, and that's very unusual. They could hold property, and they could even join the they could even join the priesthood, making them priestesses. So really briefly, I want to talk about science and technology in Mesopotamia. Mesopotamians were brilliant inventors, and in fact, they invented the wheel, the sail, the plow. They discovered bronze and how to use it. They invented arithmetic and geometry, so thanks, Mesopotamians, for that one. And they used those things, arithmetic and geometry, to help build walls and to design their fields. Mesopotamians used base 60. So we tend to use base 10 in our own arithmetic, where everything's based on tens. Well, Mesopotamians use base 60, in which that's kind of actually how we get our modern idea for 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, and all that. It's also where we get the idea for 360 degrees in a circle, because the Mesopotamians use that. They